My son looked me straight in the eye and said, "Mom, you already told me that story twice today." Like I was nothing more than a broken record he had to endure. The words echoed in my mind as I sat in my empty kitchen in suburban Chicago, staring at the phone that never rang unless someone needed money. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this sounds familiar, please just leave a like and subscribe. It'll help me keep sharing these painful truths. My name is Margaret Ellen Sullivan, and for 73 years, I've been everyone's solution and nobody's priority. The worn gold wedding band on my finger catches the afternoon light streaming through the kitchen window. The same window where I've watched seasons change while waiting for visits that never came, calls that never happened, and recognition that never arrived. I was just finishing the story about Tommy's broken arm. He was 9 then, my brave little boy who thought he could fly off our backyard shed in Lincoln Park. I remember every detail. His Superman cape fluttering as he jumped, the sickening crack when he hit the ground, his terrified wails that cut through my heart like glass. I held him the entire ride to Northwestern Memorial, humming, "You Are My Sunshine," so he wouldn't panic, my own hands shaking as I watched his face contort with pain. I told it with warmth in my voice, not for laughs or sympathy, just to be remembered, just to matter for a moment in my 47-year-old son's busy life. He looked up from his iPhone, that expensive device I'd helped him buy when his consulting firm was going through a rough patch, and sighed with the kind of exasperation reserved for telemarketers and door-to-door salesmen. "Mom?" he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of barely contained irritation. "You already told me that. Twice. Today." He smiled afterward like it was nothing, like swatting away a mosquito. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. It was the moment I realized that in his eyes, I was no longer a person with stories worth hearing, memories worth cherishing, or feelings worth considering. I had become nothing more than a glitch in his day, a malfunctioning piece of background noise he had to tolerate out of biological obligation. I swallowed the silence that followed, just like I had swallowed so many other humiliations over the past decade. The birthday he forgot last year, my 72nd, when I sat alone with a grocery store cupcake and a single candle, singing happy birthday to myself in a voice that cracked with loneliness. The Christmas morning when I woke up to empty silence because everyone was too busy to visit, but somehow found time to text me their gift lists. The time his wife Jennifer rolled her eyes when I brought over homemade chicken soup during her bout with flu, dismissing it as old people food, before asking if I could just Venmo money for takeout instead. Tommy, now Thomas, as he insisted on being called in professional settings, adjusted his designer tie and glanced at his Apple Watch. "I really need to get going, Mom. The merger meetings are running late, and Jennifer's expecting me home by 7 for the kids' soccer practice." The kids. My grandchildren. Lily, 12, and Marcus, 9. Beautiful children who barely knew me beyond the birthday checks and Christmas gifts that arrived like clockwork, each one carefully selected and generously funded by my retirement savings. Children who called me Grandma Margaret, in the same formal tone they might use for a distant acquaintance. Not the woman who had prayed for their safe arrivals, who had held them as newborns, who had saved every school photo they'd ever taken. I got in my car, a sensible 2018 Honda Accord that I'd purchased outright with cash, no financing needed, and drove home through the familiar streets of Lincoln Park. Past the coffee shop where Thomas used to stop for hot chocolate after his Little League games. Past the park where I'd pushed him on swings until my arms ached. Past the library where we'd spent countless summer afternoons reading together, his small head resting against my shoulder as I turned the pages of picture books he'd long since forgotten. No music accompanied my drive home. Just the rhythmic ticking of the turn signal and the weight of a million memories pressing against my chest like a concrete block. Each traffic light, each familiar landmark, each tree I'd watched grow from sapling to shade provider served as a monument to time past and love unreturned. When I reached my modest 2-bedroom home on Ashland Avenue, the same house where Thomas had grown up, where his father Robert and I had built 37 years of marriage before cancer took him away, I didn't even remove my coat. I walked directly to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed Robert and I had shared, and stared at my reflection in the dresser mirror. The woman looking back at me had silver hair that I'd stopped coloring 2 years ago when I realized no one noticed anyway. Deep lines mapped the geography of 7 decades of laughter, worry, and tears. My blue eyes, once bright with hope and possibility, now held the particular weariness that comes from loving people who take that love for granted. Was I repeating myself? Had I really become that woman? The one people pity at dinner parties? The one they tolerate out of guilt? The one they only call when they need something signed or something paid? The woman whose stories become background noise, whose presence becomes an obligation, whose love becomes a burden rather than a gift? And oh dear God, how much I had paid. Not just in money, though the financial cost had been staggering. I had paid in dignity, in self-respect, in the slow erosion of my identity from beloved mother to convenient ATM. When Robert died 3 years ago, I didn't just bury the love of my life. I buried my last line of defense against a world that suddenly saw me as nothing more than an aging wallet with a pulse. I had $2.4 million in savings when Robert passed away, money we'd accumulated over 4 decades of careful living, smart investments, and countless small sacrifices. Robert had been meticulous about our financial future, always saying, "Maggie, this is for your golden years, for travel, for comfort, for the life we dreamed about when we retire. Golden years." The phrase now tasted bitter in my mouth as I sat in the gathering darkness of my bedroom, still wearing my coat like armor against the chill that had nothing to do with Chicago's October weather. Instead of traveling to Ireland like Robert and I had planned, instead of finally taking that pottery class I'd always wanted, instead of living, I had helped. The word itself had become a weapon in my family's arsenal, sharp and cutting, wielded whenever bank accounts ran low or desires exceeded means. It started innocently enough. 3 months after Robert's funeral, when the grief was still so fresh that I could barely function, Thomas lost his consulting position at Morrison & Associates. "Just temporary," he assured me over coffee at our kitchen table, his hands fidgeting with the sugar packets. "The market's tough right now, but I've got several leads. Jennifer's pretty stressed about the mortgage, though." Jennifer. My daughter-in-law, who had never quite warmed to me, who spoke to me in the clipped professional tone she used with service providers. She was beautiful in that polished, expensive way that came from regular spa treatments and personal trainers. Everything about her screamed money. Money I had helped provide through the years, without ever receiving so much as a genuine smile in return. "How much do you need?" I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. The same words that would become my automatic response to every crisis, every emergency, every carefully orchestrated sob story that followed. Just enough to cover the mortgage for a couple months. Maybe $8,000? "I'll pay you back as soon as I land something new." $8,000. I wrote the check that same afternoon, my hands trembling slightly as I signed my name. Robert's voice echoed in my memory. "Be careful, Maggie. Thomas has never learned the value of money, but Robert was gone, and Thomas was my son, my only child. And wasn't this what mothers were supposed to do?" The payback never came. Instead, 6 weeks later, came another request. Their SUV had broken down, the luxury Escalade that cost more than some people's annual salaries. "The transmission's shot, Mom. We need reliable transportation with the kids and all." Another check. $15,000 this time. Then came private school tuition for Lily and Marcus. "The public schools in our district just aren't cutting it," Jennifer explained during one of their rare visits, her manicured nails tapping impatiently against my kitchen table. "We want what's best for the children, and Riverside Academy has an exceptional reputation. Exceptional tuition, too. $28,000 per year per child." I liquidated one of Robert's carefully managed investment accounts to cover it. The pattern established itself like a malignant growth. Crisis, phone call, check, empty gratitude, silence. Each transaction followed by promises that were forgotten before the ink dried on the deposit slips. Each payment accompanied by explanations of why this time was different, why this emergency couldn't wait, why I was the only solution to problems that seemed to multiply like rabbits. Marcus needed braces. Lily wanted to attend summer camp in Colorado. Their house required a new roof after a hailstorm. Jennifer deserved a spa retreat in Napa Valley for her emotional stress from managing the household budget, a budget that apparently never included provisions for paying me back. I said yes every time, because love says yes, doesn't it? Because mothers sacrifice for their children and grandmothers ensure their grandchildren have opportunities. Because the alternative, saying no, felt like admitting that I didn't care enough, wasn't devoted enough, hadn't earned my place in their increasingly busy lives. The thank yous, so effusive in the beginning, gradually became perfunctory. Thanks, Mom. You're a lifesaver evolved into, got it, thanks, and eventually into expectant silence, as if my financial support was as natural and inevitable as sunrise. I never asked to be paid back after those first few hollow promises. I just wanted to be valued, to be included, to receive phone calls that didn't begin with, "Hey Mom, quick question about," followed by calculations and due dates and urgent timelines. But the calls came only when something broke, or someone needed a cosigner for a loan I'd end up covering anyway. They visited only when documents required signatures or when major purchases needed justification. They loved me only when it was convenient, when my presence served a purpose beyond the purely sentimental. The rest of the time, I was an echo in the hallway of their lives, acknowledged when I made noise, forgotten when I stayed quiet. My 72nd birthday last year proved just how invisible I had become. I spent the morning preparing dinner for 6, convinced that surely this time they would remember. I cleaned the house until it sparkled, arranged fresh flowers from my garden, and prepared Thomas's favorite meal, pot roast with the herb crust recipe my mother had taught me 60 years ago. 6 o'clock came and went, then 7, 8, 9. At 10:15, I received a text from Thomas. "Sorry, Mom, crazy day. Rain check?" Rain check. As if my birthday was a baseball game that could be rescheduled at his convenience. I sat alone in my dining room with the table set for 6, staring at the untouched pot roast that had long since grown cold. The birthday cake I'd bought at the grocery store, a small, modest thing with "Happy Birthday" written in cheerful blue icing, sat on the counter with a single candle I'd never lit. I sang "Happy Birthday" to myself in a voice that cracked with loneliness, the words echoing off the empty walls of a house that had once been filled with laughter and love. The silence that followed was so complete, so profound, that I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and the clock ticking on the mantelpiece. Sounds that had been masked for decades by the noise of family life. 3 days later, Thomas called. Not to apologize, not to acknowledge the birthday he'd missed, but to ask if I could wire $200 for a quick emergency. Something about a client dinner that required immediate payment and a credit card that was temporarily maxed out. I sent the money within an hour of his call. And when the transfer was complete, when the funds had vanished from my account into his, he didn't even say, "I love you," just, "Thanks, Mom. Gotta run." That night, I opened my banking app for the first time in months. Robert had always handled our finances, and after his death, I'd largely ignored the details, trusting that my careful spending and Thomas's assurances that he was managing things responsibly meant our accounts remained healthy. What I saw on that small screen made my blood run cold. Line after line of withdrawals and transfers. Restaurants I'd never eaten at. Toys I'd never touched. Spa treatments I'd never enjoyed. Vacation bookings for trips I'd never taken. All charged to accounts bearing my name. All paid with money I'd earned through a lifetime of careful saving. Was I being used? The question haunted me through the sleepless hours that followed. Was I being used? It echoed in my mind like a prayer I was afraid to finish, a truth I wasn't ready to face even as the evidence mounted around me like snow in a Chicago blizzard. The microaggressions had been there all along, hadn't they? Small cuts that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively bled me dry of dignity and self-worth. I'd dismiss them as misunderstandings, generational differences, the natural friction that comes when adult children build lives that don't quite have room for their aging parents. But now, sitting in my kitchen at 3 in the morning with bank statements spread across the table like tarot cards predicting financial ruin, I began to see the pattern with horrifying clarity. Last Christmas, when I'd spent 2 weeks and nearly $400 preparing homemade gifts for everyone, hand-knitted scarves for Thomas and Jennifer, carefully curated photo albums for the grandchildren filled with pictures spanning their entire lives. Jennifer had unwrapped her scarf with the kind of forced smile usually reserved for restaurant servers announcing they were out of your first choice. "Oh," she'd said, holding the soft cashmere blend yarn between her fingers like it might contaminate her manicure. "How thoughtful. I don't really wear scarves, though. The dry cleaning is such a hassle." Dry cleaning. For a hand-washable scarf I'd made with love, spending hours selecting the perfect shade of blue to match her eyes. Thomas had barely glanced at his before setting it aside to check his phone. "Thanks, Mom," he'd mumbled, his attention already elsewhere. "Very nice." Meanwhile, they'd given me a gift card to Target. $50. The kind of present you give to someone whose preferences you've never bothered to learn, whose interests remain a mystery despite decades of shared life. The grandchildren had torn through their photo albums in seconds, flipping past carefully arranged memories of birthdays, first steps, school plays, and family vacations. "Cool Grandma Margaret," Lily had said with the practiced politeness of a child who'd been coached on proper thank you protocols. Then they'd return to their new iPads, devices that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. iPads I'd helped purchase, though my contribution had been folded into the general family expenses that Thomas managed with such careful opacity. Or the time last spring when I'd contracted pneumonia. For 3 days I'd lain in bed with a fever that made my bones ache, and a cough that felt like broken glass in my chest. I'd finally managed to call Thomas on the 4th day, my voice barely a whisper. "I've been quite sick," I'd told him, trying not to sound as desperate as I felt. "Pneumonia. The doctor says it could be serious at my age." "Oh no, that's awful," he'd responded with the automatic sympathy of someone multitasking. I could hear keyboard clicking in the background. "You should really get some rest. Jennifer's been dealing with a cold too, so we probably shouldn't visit until everyone's feeling better. You understand. Jennifer's cold." Treated with the same gravity as my pneumonia. I'd hung up the phone and spent the next week alone, surviving on canned soup and the occasional grocery delivery. My neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, had checked on me more than my own son. She'd brought homemade tamales and sat with me for an hour, talking in her careful English about her own children who lived in California and called every Sunday without fail. "Family is everything," she'd said, patting my hand with her work-worn fingers. "But sometimes we must teach them how to love us properly." At the time, I'd thought she was simply offering comfort. Now I wondered if she'd seen something I'd been too blind to recognize. The cruelest cut had come just 6 weeks ago, during what should have been a celebration. Thomas had finally landed a new consulting contract, a major client that would provide steady income for at least 2 years. He'd called to share the good news, his voice bright with excitement for the first time in months. "This is it, Mom. This is the break we've been waiting for. Jennifer can finally relax about the finances." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I'd said, genuine joy warming my voice. "I'm so proud of you. I knew things would turn around." There was a pause. Then, "Yeah, well, we couldn't have made it through without your help. We won't forget that." But they had forgotten. Within a week of his first paycheck, when I'd gently mentioned that perhaps we could discuss some kind of repayment plan for the accumulated loans, not demanding immediate payment, just acknowledgement that these hadn't been gifts, Thomas had responded with wounded incredulity. "I can't believe you're keeping track," he'd said, his voice sharp with accusation. "I thought family helped each other without keeping score. Dad never would have—" He'd stopped himself before finishing the sentence, but the implication hung between us like poison gas. My dead husband, his beloved father, wouldn't have been so petty as to expect repayment, wouldn't have been so selfish as to track the money hemorrhaging from his widow's accounts. The manipulation was surgical in its precision. By invoking Robert's memory, Thomas had transformed my reasonable request into an act of betrayal against everything his father had represented. In a single conversation, I'd been recast from generous mother to grasping creditor, from family member to outsider who didn't understand how real families operated. I'd apologized. Actually apologized for asking about my own money. That night, I'd sat in Robert's chair, the worn leather recliner where he'd spent his final months reading mystery novels and watching Cubs games, and tried to remember when I'd become so afraid of my own son's disapproval. When had his love become conditional on my willingness to bankroll his lifestyle? When had I started measuring my worth by my utility? The bank statements spread before me now told a story I'd been too frightened to read. In the 3 years since Robert's death, I'd transferred over $180,000 to various accounts linked to Thomas and Jennifer. Money for emergencies that never seemed to end. Investments in their future that somehow never paid dividends of affection or respect. But worse than the raw numbers were the dates. I could trace my loneliness through the financial records like following breadcrumbs through a dark forest. The largest transfers coincided with the longest silences. The most generous gifts preceded the coldest treatment. It was as if my family had developed an internal radar for my emotional vulnerability, calling when grief made me pliable, visiting when desperation made me grateful for any attention at all. I found myself remembering a conversation with Jennifer from last month. I'd stopped by unannounced, something that had once been normal, welcomed even, but now required careful choreography to avoid inconvenience. She'd answered the door in expensive yoga clothes, clearly prepared to head out. "Oh, Margaret," she'd said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I wasn't expecting you." The formality of my name instead of Mom had stung more than I'd let myself acknowledge at the time. I'd been Margaret to my colleagues, Mrs. Sullivan to my neighbors, but never Margaret to the woman who'd married my son, who'd borne my grandchildren, who'd shared family dinners at my table for 15 years. "I brought some books for the children," I'd offered, holding up a bag from the bookstore. "That series Lily mentioned she wanted to read. That's sweet, but they're pretty busy with schoolwork right now. Maybe you could just leave them on the porch. I really do need to get to my Pilates class." Pilates class. Paid for, I now realized, with money I'd transferred just days earlier for what Thomas had described as unexpected medical expenses. I'd left the books on the porch like a delivery driver. Walking back to my car with cheeks burning from humiliation I'd tried to convince myself was mere awkwardness. But it wasn't awkwardness. It was cruelty dressed up as inconvenience. It was the systematic erosion of my place in a family I'd spent my life nurturing, building, and funding. Standing in my empty kitchen as dawn approached, I made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. I walked to the safe Robert had installed in our bedroom closet. The same safe where we'd kept important documents, jewelry that mattered, and cash for emergencies. My hands shook as I entered the combination. Our wedding date. Numbers that had once represented the beginning of everything beautiful in my life. Inside, I found the documents I'd placed there just after Robert's funeral. Bank account information, investment portfolios, insurance policies, and a will that left everything to Thomas. Everything. $2.4 million, plus the house, plus Robert's pension benefits. All of it destined for a son who couldn't remember to call on my birthday but never forgot to call when he needed money. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I'd written on a slip of paper months ago, but never had the courage to use. A financial advisor, Jennifer Rodriguez, Mrs. Rodriguez's daughter, had recommended when she'd seen me struggling with investment statements I didn't understand. "Hello, this is Margaret Sullivan," I said when the voicemail picked up. "I need to schedule an appointment as soon as possible. I want to make some changes to my accounts." As I spoke those words aloud, something shifted inside me. Not quite hope. That felt too ambitious. But something like determination. Something like the faint recognition that I still had choices to make. Something like the beginning of remembering who I used to be before I became nothing more than a convenient solution to other people's problems. The financial advisor, Patricia Chen, had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the patient demeanor of someone who'd guided many widows through the treacherous waters of late-life financial planning. Her office in downtown Chicago overlooked Lake Michigan, where autumn waves crashed against the shore with the same relentless rhythm that had been draining my bank accounts. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said after reviewing my statements for nearly an hour, "I need to ask you something directly. Are you aware that your current spending pattern will leave you completely depleted within 18 months? The words hit me like ice water. 18 months. Less time than it took to grow a decent tomato garden, and I'd be destitute. That can't be right," I stammered. though the numbers swimming before my eyes suggested otherwise. Patricia leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. You've transferred over $200,000 in the past year alone. Your son has power of attorney on 3 of your major accounts, and based on these withdrawal patterns, she paused, studying my face with professional concern. Margaret, may I call you Margaret? Has your family discussed any of this with you? Power of attorney. The phrase echoed in my head like a death knell. When had I signed those papers? I remembered Thomas mentioning something about making things easier after Robert's funeral, about streamlining the finances, so I wouldn't have to worry about complex investment decisions while I was grieving. I'd signed whatever he'd put in front of me, trusting that my son had my best interests at heart. I think, I said slowly, the words feeling foreign in my mouth, I think I've been very foolish. Patricia's expression softened. You've been generous. There's a difference. But generosity without boundaries becomes exploitation, even when the exploiters are family, especially when they're family. That afternoon, I drove home with a folder full of documents I didn't fully understand, but knew represented my first steps toward reclaiming control. Patricia had helped me freeze the accounts where Thomas had signatory authority and open new ones in my name alone. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger immediate alarm bells. Just quiet repositioning of assets while I figured out my next move. I didn't have to wait long for the consequences. My phone rang at 7:23 p.m. on a Tuesday. Thomas's name flashed on the screen with the urgency of someone who'd just discovered his ATM card had been declined. Mom, there's some kind of problem with the accounts, he said without preamble, his voice tight with the barely controlled panic of someone accustomed to financial access, suddenly finding doors locked. I tried to transfer money for Marcus's orthodontist appointment, and the bank says I don't have authorization. I know, I said simply. Silence stretched between us like a chasm. I could hear Jennifer's voice in the background, sharp with questions he couldn't yet answer. What do you mean, you know? His tone shifted from confusion to something harder, more demanding. Did you do something to the accounts? I protected them, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. I protected what's left of my money. The explosion was immediate and volcanic. What's left? Mom, what are you talking about? That money isn't just yours, it's family money. Dad meant for it to take care of all of us. There it was again. Robert's memory weaponized against me. My dead husband's intentions interpreted to justify my living family's entitlement. Your father meant for it to take care of me, I said quietly. He spent 40 years working to ensure I'd be secure in my old age. Not to ensure you'd never have to worry about braces or private school tuition. I can't believe this, Thomas sputtered, his voice rising to a pitch I hadn't heard since his teenage tantrums. After everything we've been through, everything I've done for you, what exactly have you done for me, Thomas? The question hung in the air like a lit fuse. I genuinely wanted to know. In 3 years of widowhood, of loneliness so profound it felt like drowning, of birthdays forgotten and illnesses ignored, what had my son actually done for me beyond take what I offered? I manage your finances. I handle the complicated stuff you don't understand. I make sure you're not getting scammed by some smooth-talking advisor. You mean Patricia Chen? The woman who just showed me that I'll be broke in 18 months if nothing changes? Another silence, this one loaded with the weight of exposure. When Thomas spoke again, his voice had shifted to that particular tone he used when closing business deals. Calculated, manipulative, designed to move pieces on a board I was only beginning to see. Mom, you're clearly confused. Overwhelmed. This is exactly why I've been helping with the finances. You're not thinking clearly. Confused. Overwhelmed. Not thinking clearly. The language of diminishment, designed to make me doubt my own perceptions and capabilities. How many times had he used these phrases over the past 3 years? How many decisions had I deferred because I'd been convinced I wasn't competent to make them myself? I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, I said. Look, obviously there's been some misunderstanding. Why don't Jennifer and I come over this weekend? We'll bring the kids, make it a nice family dinner, and we can sort all this out. A nice family dinner. The carrot offered after the stick had failed to produce compliance. Quality time as a reward for reopening the financial spigot. When was the last time you came for dinner without needing something? I asked. Mom, that's not fair. When, Thomas? When was the last time you called just to see how I was feeling? When did you last ask about my life instead of asking about my money? The silence that followed was answer enough. Jennifer's voice grew louder in the background, and I could make out fragments of increasingly agitated conversation. Words like stubborn and impossible and call her doctor drifted through the phone like smoke signals from a burning bridge. When Thomas returned to our conversation, Jennifer was clearly coaching him, her voice a constant whisper of suggestions and strategies. Mom, Jennifer thinks maybe you should talk to someone, a counselor or, someone who specializes in seniors who are having trouble with decision-making. Seniors having trouble with decision-making, the euphemism for what they really meant. An old woman losing her marbles, incompetent to manage her own affairs, in need of protection from her own poor judgment. I am talking to someone, I said calmly. A financial advisor who showed me exactly where my money has been going. Would you like me to read you the list? This is ridiculous, Thomas snapped, his businessman facade finally cracking. You're being manipulated by some stranger who just wants to manage your assets for their commission. Can't you see that? The irony was breathtaking. My son, who had systematically drained my accounts for years, was warning me about someone else's financial motivations. Patricia Chen charges me $150 an hour for advice, I said. You've cost me $200,000 in 3 years. Who's manipulating whom? The line went quiet except for furious whispering I wasn't supposed to hear. When Thomas returned, his voice had taken on the careful tone of someone negotiating with a hostage taker. Okay, let's say you're right. Let's say we've borrowed more than we should have. We can work out a payment plan. But freezing the accounts? That's just going to hurt everyone, including Lily and Marcus. Is that really what you want? To punish your grandchildren because you're angry at us? The grandchildren. The nuclear option in every family guilt campaign. Love them and prove it by funding their lifestyle without question. Criticize their parents' financial irresponsibility, and you're punishing innocent children. But I thought about Lily and Marcus. Really thought about them for the first time in months. What was I teaching them by modeling this dynamic? That love was transactional? That grandparents existed to solve problems money could fix? That respect was optional as long as the checks kept coming? I love my grandchildren, I said slowly. Which is why I'm not going to teach them that people who love you are obligated to bankrupt themselves for your convenience. Mom? I'm not punishing them, Thomas. I'm refusing to enable you. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking not with fear, but with something that felt almost like exhilaration. For the first time in 3 years, I'd spoken truth instead of swallowing it. I'd chosen my own well-being over their comfort. The phone rang again immediately, then again, then a text. We need to talk about this face-to-face. The kids are asking questions. Another text, this one from Jennifer's phone. Margaret, I think you're having some kind of episode. We're worried about you. An episode. Medical language designed to pathologize my resistance to their financial abuse. I turned off my phone and sat in the gathering darkness of my kitchen, listening to the house settle around me. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt peaceful. Tomorrow, I knew, the real battle would begin. They would marshal arguments, recruit allies, perhaps even attempt legal maneuvers to restore their access to my accounts. They would paint me as confused, vindictive, manipulated by outsiders who didn't understand our family dynamics. But tonight, in this moment of quiet, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Robert's death, the profound relief of stopping a hemorrhage that had been slowly bleeding me to death. I was no longer just Margaret the ATM, Margaret the solution to other people's problems. Margaret the woman who said yes because she was too afraid of losing love to risk saying no. I was Margaret Sullivan, widow of Robert Sullivan, mother of Thomas Sullivan, grandmother of Lily and Marcus Sullivan, and I was finally ready to fight for what was mine. The morning after I turned off my phone, I woke at 5:47 a.m. to something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Silence that felt like sanctuary rather than abandonment. No urgent calls about financial emergencies. No guilt-laden texts about disappointed grandchildren. No manipulative messages designed to make me question my own judgment. Just the gentle sound of autumn rain against my bedroom windows and the profound peace that comes from choosing yourself for the first time in decades. I made coffee. Real coffee, not the instant variety I'd been buying to save money for Thomas's endless needs, and sat at my kitchen table with Patricia Chen's folder spread before me. Numbers that had once seemed overwhelming now felt manageable. Accounts that had been hemorrhaging money were finally secure. For the first time since Robert's death, I had a clear picture of what belonged to me. $847,000 remaining in accessible funds. The house, valued at $320,000, owned outright. Robert's pension, which provided $2,100 monthly. Social Security adding another $1,600. More than enough to live comfortably, even luxuriously, if I wasn't supporting an entire extended family's lifestyle. I did something I hadn't done in years. I planned a day for myself. First stop, Northwestern Memorial Hospital, where I scheduled the comprehensive physical I'd been postponing for 8 months. Dr. Martinez had been urging me to get a full workup, but somehow Thomas's needs had always taken priority. Emergency dental work for Lily, Marcus's sports physical, Jennifer's stress-related health issues that required expensive spa treatments masquerading as medical necessity. Mrs. Sullivan, the receptionist said warmly, "We haven't seen you in quite a while. Dr. Martinez will be so pleased." As I filled out forms, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd prioritized my own health. When had I started treating my well-being as optional, something to address only after everyone else's needs were met? The appointment revealed what Dr. Martinez called concerning but correctable issues. Blood pressure elevated from stress, vitamin deficiencies from poor nutrition, and the kind of chronic fatigue that comes from carrying emotional burdens too heavy for one person to bear. "Margaret," she said, reviewing my chart with the focused attention I'd forgotten medical professionals could provide, "when did you last do something purely for pleasure? Not obligation, not necessity, just joy." I couldn't answer. The question felt foreign, like being asked to recall a language I'd once spoken fluently, but had forgotten through disuse. "I want you to try something," Dr. Martinez continued. "One thing each day that's just for you. A walk by the lake. A book you've wanted to read. A class you've always been curious about. Your body is telling me you've been in survival mode for too long." Survival mode. The phrase resonated with uncomfortable accuracy. I'd been so busy keeping everyone else's lives comfortable that I'd forgotten I was supposed to be living, not just enduring. From the hospital, I drove to a place I hadn't visited in over a year, the Chicago Botanic Garden in Glencoe. Robert and I had been members for 20 years, spending countless Sunday afternoons wandering the themed gardens and greenhouse conservatories. After his death, the beauty had felt too painful, too connected to memories that made grief unbearable. But today, walking the Heritage Garden where golden maples dropped their leaves like scattered coins, I felt something shift. The sadness remained, but it had transformed from sharp grief into gentle melancholy. Robert wasn't gone from these paths. He was part of them, woven into every bench where we'd rested, every flower bed we'd admired together. I found myself at the Rose Garden, where a few late-season blooms persisted despite October's chill. On impulse, I called the membership office from my cell phone, the same phone I'd kept turned off for 18 hours, the longest communication silence I'd maintained in years. "I'd like to upgrade my membership," I told the surprised representative, "to the level that includes classes and special events." The patron level cost $400 annually, money I would have automatically categorized as too extravagant just days earlier. Money that represented less than Thomas spent on a single dinner out with Jennifer, less than one of Lily's designer handbags, a fraction of Marcus's monthly video game purchases. But it was my money, and for the first time in years, I was spending it on something that brought me joy. The drive home took me past Riverside Academy, where my grandchildren attended school on my financial contributions. I found myself pulling into the visitor parking lot, not sure what I intended to do, but drawn by curiosity about what $56,000 annually in tuition actually provided. The building was impressive. Red brick and ivy, manicured grounds that spoke of serious investment in aesthetics. Through the windows, I could see children in uniforms that probably cost more than many families spent on back-to-school shopping. A teacher emerged from the building, and on impulse, I approached her. "Excuse me," I said. "I'm Margaret Sullivan. My grandchildren, Lily and Marcus Sullivan, attend here. I'm the one who pays their tuition." The woman's face brightened with recognition. "Oh, Mrs. Sullivan! Of course! I'm Mrs. Patterson, Lily's English teacher." "She's mentioned her grandmother several times." My heart skipped. "She has?" "Oh yes, she wrote a beautiful essay about family heroes for our writing assignment. She talked about how you taught her to garden when she was little, how you always remember her favorite books. She was so proud when she told the class about your homemade cookies." I blinked back sudden tears. Lily remembered the gardening lessons? The cookies I'd stopped making because Jennifer complained about the children eating too much sugar? "She seems to think very highly of you," Mrs. Patterson continued. "In fact, she asked if you might be interested in visiting as a guest speaker for our unit on family history. She wanted to share some of your stories about growing up in Chicago." Stories. The same stories Thomas dismissed as repetitive rambling were treasures to my granddaughter. "I would love that," I said, my voice thick with emotion. That evening, I did something revolutionary. I cooked dinner for one person. Not the large portions I'd grown accustomed to making in hopes that family might drop by unannounced. Just a simple salmon fillet with roasted vegetables, prepared with care and attention, eaten slowly while reading a mystery novel I'd bought months ago, but never had time to open. The house felt different around me. Not empty, spacious, not lonely, peaceful. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't waiting for someone to need me. I wasn't anticipating the next crisis that would require my financial intervention. I wasn't measuring the silence by how long it had been since someone had called. I was simply present in my own life. My phone, which I'd finally turned back on, showed 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. The progression told a story. Confusion. "Mom, why aren't you answering?" Concern. "Are you okay? We're worried." Irritation. "This is ridiculous, call us back." Manipulation. "The kids are asking why Grandma is angry at them." And finally, threats. "We're coming over tomorrow whether you like it or not." But reading them now, from my position of newfound clarity, I could see them for what they truly were. Not expressions of love or concern, but panic from people who'd suddenly lost access to their primary funding source. The most telling message had come from Jennifer. "Margaret, I've been thinking about our relationship, and I realize I may not have always expressed how much we appreciate everything you do for us. Maybe we could have lunch this week? Just the two of us?" Lunch. Just the two of us. The woman who'd treated me like a barely tolerated stranger for 15 years suddenly wanted one-on-one time. The timing was fascinating and transparent. I poured myself a glass of wine, a nice Pinot Grigio I'd splurged on at the grocery store, and composed a group text to Thomas, Jennifer, and both grandchildren. "I'm fine and safe. I need some time to think about our family dynamics and financial arrangements. I won't be available for visits or calls this week. I love you all." Then I turned off the phone again. That night, I took a bath in my own tub, a luxury I'd denied myself for months because the water bill was too high, and I needed to save money for the family's various needs. I lit candles I'd been saving for special occasions, and used the expensive bath oils Robert had given me for our last Christmas together. As I sank into the warm water, surrounded by soft candlelight and the scent of lavender, I realized this was a special occasion. The first day of remembering that I mattered. Outside, October wind rattled the windows, but inside, I was warm and safe, and finally, blessedly alone with my own thoughts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more confrontations, additional attempts to guilt me back into compliance. But tonight, I was Margaret Sullivan, and I was enough, just as I was. Without apology, without explanation, without justification. For the first time in 3 years, I went to sleep feeling like the protagonist of my own life, rather than a supporting character in everyone else's story. And I slept better than I had since the night before Robert died, when I'd still believed that love guaranteed loyalty, that sacrifice ensured appreciation, that being needed was the same thing as being valued. Now I knew better. And that knowledge, painful as it was, had finally set me free to discover who I could become when I stopped being who everyone else needed me to be. They came on a Saturday morning at 8:47 a.m., while I was still in my robe, sipping coffee and reading the Tribune in my sunlit kitchen. The doorbell's sharp chime cut through my peaceful morning like an alarm, followed immediately by Thomas's voice calling through the door with forced cheerfulness. "Mom, we know you're in there. We brought breakfast from Lou Mitchell's, your favorite blueberry pancakes." Lou Mitchell's, the diner where Robert and I had eaten breakfast every Sunday for 30 years. They were using sacred memories as ammunition now, weaponizing nostalgia to breach the defenses I'd spent a week building. I opened the door to find the entire family assembled on my front porch like a military operation. Thomas stood at the front, holding a takeout bag with the restaurant's familiar logo. Jennifer flanked him, her face arranged in an expression of concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. Behind them, Lily and Marcus shifted uncomfortably, clearly coached for this performance but uncertain of their roles. "Hi, Grandma Margaret," Lily said with forced brightness. "We missed you." The words hit their intended target. When had Lily last called me anything other than Grandma Margaret? When had either child expressed missing me without prompting? But looking at her now, I could see the discomfort in her 12-year-old eyes, the awareness that she was being used as an emotional weapon against someone she genuinely cared about. "Hello, sweetheart," I said gently, then stepped aside to let them enter. Not because I'd been manipulated, but because I wanted this confrontation to happen on my territory, in the house where I held all the power. Thomas set the breakfast bag on my kitchen counter with the ceremonial gravity of someone placing an offering on an altar. "We were worried sick about you, Mom. Going a whole week without contact? That's not like you." "Actually," I said, settling into my favorite chair, Robert's old recliner that I'd finally claimed as my own. "It's exactly like the old me. The me who existed before I became your personal bank." Jennifer's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the flash of irritation she usually kept hidden. "Margaret, that's a very hurtful thing to say. We've never thought of you as what?" I interrupted. "As someone whose only value comes from solving your financial problems. As someone who doesn't deserve basic courtesy unless there's money involved." Thomas sat forward, shifting into the negotiation posture I'd seen him use during business calls. "Mom, let's talk about this rationally. You've made your point. We understand you felt taken for granted and we're sorry about that. But freezing the accounts? That's extreme. Is it?" I pulled out the folder Patricia Chen had given me, spreading the financial statements across my coffee table like playing cards. "Thomas, do you know how much money you've taken from me in 3 years? Borrowed," he corrected automatically. "We borrowed money during a difficult time. $237,000, I continued, ignoring his semantics. "That's not counting the credit cards you asked me to co-sign, the loans you needed me to guarantee, or the small emergencies that required immediate wire transfers." Jennifer's face had gone pale. Even she hadn't realized the full scope of their financial dependency. "When exactly were you planning to pay any of it back?" I asked quietly. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Marcus, sensing tension he didn't understand, moved closer to his sister. These children, my grandchildren whom I loved deeply, were witnessing their parents' exposure for the first time, seeing behind the curtain of adult explanations and justifications. Thomas's businessman facade finally cracked. "Look, we both know Dad left that money for all of us, for the family. He wouldn't have wanted you hoarding it while your son and grandchildren struggle." There it was again, Robert's ghost summoned to guilt me into compliance. But this time, instead of the usual stab of grief and shame, I felt something else entirely: anger. Clean, righteous fury at having my dead husband's love perverted into a tool for manipulation. "Don't you dare," I said, my voice deadly quiet. "Don't you dare use your father's memory to justify what you've done to me." "What we've done?" Jennifer's voice rose with indignation. "We're family. Families help each other." "Help?" I stood up, and something in my posture made them all step back. "When have you helped me? When I had pneumonia and lay in bed for a week while you worried about Jennifer's cold? When I spent my 72nd birthday alone because you were too busy? When I called you crying after the anniversary of your father's death and you cut the conversation short because you had dinner reservations? That's not fair, Thomas began. Fair? The word came out as a laugh, but there was no humor in it. You want to talk about fair? Let me tell you what fair looks like. I walked to my desk and pulled out a document I'd prepared with Patricia's help. A comprehensive accounting of every dollar, every loan, every emergency that had systematically drained my retirement savings. Fair is Lily's private school tuition, $56,000 per year. Fair is Marcus's orthodontics, sports camps, and tutoring, $18,000. Fair is your mortgage payments when you lost your job, $32,000. Fair is Jennifer's spa retreats for stress management, $8,000. Fair is the luxury SUV you needed for family safety, $43,000. With each item, I placed a sheet of paper on the coffee table. Bank statements, canceled checks, wire transfer receipts, the physical evidence of my financial dismantling laid out like an autopsy report. Fair, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each revelation, is 3 years of being treated like an ATM with a pulse. 3 years of having my love measured by my utility. 3 years of watching you take everything I offered and then act like I was selfish for expecting basic human decency in return. Lily was crying now, not understanding the adult complexities, but sensing the pain radiating from all the adults around her. Marcus had moved to the window, staring out at the garden where I'd taught him to plant tomatoes just 2 summers ago. Jennifer's composure finally shattered. "This is ridiculous! You're being vindictive and cruel! Those children love you, and you're punishing them because you're angry at us." "I'm not punishing anyone," I said calmly. "I'm protecting what's left of my financial security. I'm ensuring that I don't spend my final years in poverty because I was too afraid of your disapproval to say no." Thomas tried a different approach, his voice softening with manufactured vulnerability. "Mom, I know we haven't been perfect, but we're family. We can work this out. Maybe we got too comfortable asking for help, but that's because we trusted you, because we knew you loved us." "I do love you," I said, and meant it, "but I won't buy your love anymore." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jennifer's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Thomas's face cycled through shock, denial, and finally, rage. "Fine," he said, his mask completely fallen away now. "If that's how you want to play this, we can play it your way. But don't come crying to us when you're lonely and sick and have no one to take care of you." "I'd rather be alone than bought," I replied. "You're making a huge mistake," Jennifer added, gathering her purse with sharp, angry movements. "When you're sitting in some nursing home wondering why no one visits, remember this conversation." They marshaled the children toward the door, but Lily broke away from her mother's grip and ran back to me. "Grandma Margaret," she whispered, throwing her arms around my waist. "I wrote that essay about you because you're my hero, not because of money, because you taught me that stories matter." My heart cracked open. This child, this beautiful, innocent child, had been caught in the crossfire of adult greed and manipulation, but she'd also shown me something profound. Authentic love existed in our family. It was just buried under years of transactional relationships and false priorities. "I love you too, sweetheart," I whispered back. "And I'll always love you, no matter what happens between the grown-ups." After they left, I sat in the profound silence of my empty house and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Relief so complete, it felt like rebirth. The confrontation I'd dreaded for months had finally happened, and I'd survived it. More than survived. I'd won. Not because I'd defeated them, but because I'd finally refused to defeat myself. I walked to Robert's photograph on the mantelpiece, the one taken on our 40th wedding anniversary just 6 months before his diagnosis. He was smiling at me instead of the camera, his eyes full of the love that had sustained me through 4 decades of marriage. "I'm finally learning to value myself the way you valued me," I told his image. "I'm finally becoming the woman you always believed I was." That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I called my friend Eleanor, Robert's sister, who lived in Phoenix. We'd lost touch after his funeral, partly because of geography, but mostly because I'd been too ashamed to admit how completely my life had fallen apart. "Margaret!" Eleanor's voice was warm with genuine pleasure. I was just thinking about you. How are you, honey? For the first time in years, I answered that question honestly. I'm learning to be okay, I said. I'm learning to be enough. We talked for 2 hours. About Robert. About loneliness. About the challenges of rebuilding identity after loss. Eleanor had faced her own struggles with adult children who saw their inheritance as an early entitlement, and her perspective helped me understand that my situation wasn't unique or shameful. You know what Robert used to say about you? Eleanor asked near the end of our conversation. He said you were the strongest person he knew, but you didn't know it yet. I think he'd be proud of you for finally figuring it out. That night, I slept in the center of my bed instead of clinging to one side, and I dreamed of gardens yet to be planted, books yet to be read, and a future that belonged entirely to me. 3 months later, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. The same silver hair, the same blue eyes, but something fundamental had changed. The perpetual worry lines around my mouth had softened. My shoulders no longer carried the permanent hunch of someone expecting the next emotional blow. For the first time in years, I looked like someone who was living, rather than merely surviving. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The first weeks after the confrontation had been the hardest, filled with doubt that crept in during quiet moments. Had I been too harsh? Too selfish? Would I spend the rest of my life wondering if I'd chosen pride over family? But gradually, as the fog of constant anxiety lifted, I began to remember who Margaret Sullivan actually was beneath the layers of guilt and obligation that had accumulated like sediment over the years. It started with small rebellions against the routine I'd established around other people's needs. I bought groceries for meals I actually wanted to eat instead of foods that might appeal to family members who never came to dinner. I rearranged furniture to suit my preferences rather than maintaining the configuration that best accommodated large gatherings that rarely happened. I painted the guest bedroom, Thomas's old room, a cheerful yellow that made me smile every time I passed the doorway. The painting project led to something unexpected, a conversation with my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had watched me struggling on a ladder through her kitchen window. "Margaret, mi amor," she called from her back porch, her accented English warm with genuine concern. "What are you doing up there? You could fall." I climbed down, paintbrush still in hand, suddenly aware that I was grinning like a teenager caught in some harmless mischief. "I'm making my house mine again," I told her. Mrs. Rodriguez studied my face with the penetrating gaze of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize significant moments when they occurred. "Ah," she said slowly, "you look different. Lighter. Like someone put down a heavy bag she didn't know she was carrying." That afternoon, she invited me for coffee, and I learned that Maria Rodriguez had fled an abusive marriage 40 years earlier with nothing but her 3 children and a fierce determination to build a life worthy of their futures. She'd cleaned office buildings at night while attending nursing school during the day, raised her children as a single mother, and eventually become the head of pediatric nursing at Children's Memorial Hospital. The hardest part, she told me as we sat in her kitchen surrounded by photographs of grandchildren who visited every Sunday, wasn't the poverty or the exhaustion. It was learning to believe I deserved better than what I was accepting. Her words resonated with uncomfortable accuracy. How many years had I accepted treatment I would never have tolerated for a stranger, simply because it came from family? Maria became my first real friend in decades. Not an acquaintance made through Robert's work or Thomas's school activities, but someone who chose to know me for who I was, rather than what I could provide. She introduced me to her book club, a group of women in their 60s and 70s, who met monthly to discuss literature and life with equal passion. The book club became a revelation. These women, Elena, who'd returned to college at 68 to finish the degree her early marriage had interrupted, Dorothy, who'd started a nonprofit animal rescue after her husband's death, Susan, who'd learned to paint watercolors and now sold her work at local art fairs, had all faced the challenge of rediscovering themselves after decades of defining themselves through their relationships to others. "The thing about being a wife and mother," Elena said during our discussion of The Awakening by Kate Chopin, "is that you can lose yourself so completely in those roles that you forget you were ever a separate person. When those roles change or end, you have to excavate yourself like an archaeologist." I thought about that metaphor often as I began my own excavation. What had I enjoyed before marriage and motherhood? What dreams had I deferred so completely that I'd forgotten they existed? The answer came unexpectedly during a visit to the Art Institute of Chicago, something I'd done regularly with Robert, but hadn't attempted alone since his death. Standing before a Georgia O'Keeffe painting, bold, sensual, unapologetically feminine, I remembered my teenage dreams of studying art, plans abandoned when I'd married Robert at 22 and focused on supporting his career instead of developing my own. At 73, was it too late to return to those abandoned dreams? The answer came from Mrs. Patterson, Lily's English teacher, who called about the guest speaking opportunity Lily had requested. As we planned my visit to discuss family history with her class, Mrs. Patterson mentioned the school's community education program. "We offer art classes for adults in the evenings," she said. "Drawing, watercolor, even ceramics. The instructor is wonderful. Very patient with beginners or people returning to art after long breaks." That night, I registered for Introduction to Watercolors. The class met Thursday evenings in the same building where my grandchildren attended school, but I was no longer there as Margaret Sullivan, benefactor and financier. I was simply Margaret, a woman learning to paint flowers and landscapes with shaking hands that gradually grew steady with practice. My first painting was terrible, a lopsided vase of roses that looked more like abstract blobs than recognizable flowers. But it was mine, created by my hands, reflecting my vision, existing because I had chosen to bring it into being rather than because someone else needed it to exist. The instructor, a gentle woman named Sarah who couldn't have been more than 40, offered encouragement without condescension. "Art isn't about perfection," she told our small class of mostly older women. "It's about expression, about capturing something true in whatever imperfect way we can manage." Imperfect, but true. The phrase became my new motto. My life took on a rhythm I hadn't experienced since my 20s. Book club meetings where I contributed my own thoughts rather than simply listening to others. Art classes where I struggled with perspective and color theory with the same determination I'd once applied to managing household budgets. Long walks by Lake Michigan where I watched the seasons change without feeling obligated to share the experience with anyone else. I bought a membership to the Symphony Center and attended concerts alone, something that had once seemed pitiable, but now felt luxurious. I signed up for a cooking class focused on cuisine for one, learning to prepare beautiful meals without apology for the single portion size. I joined a seniors travel group and booked a trip to Ireland, the journey Robert and I had planned but never taken. The Ireland trip, scheduled for the following spring, became a symbol of my newfound freedom. I spread travel brochures across my kitchen table, planning itineraries based solely on my own interests. Castles and gardens, small villages where I could practice my rusty watercolor skills, literary sites connected to the poets I'd loved in college but had set aside during the busy years of raising Thomas. The planning process felt revolutionary, making choices based on my desires rather than someone else's needs, spending money on experiences rather than other people's problems. It was during this period of renewal that Thomas attempted his first reconciliation. The call came on a Tuesday evening while I was cleaning paintbrushes after a particularly successful attempt at capturing the light filtering through my kitchen window. "Mom?" His voice carried a carefully modulated combination of humility and hope. "I've been thinking about our last conversation, about everything that happened." I set down my brushes and listened, curious about his approach but no longer desperate for his approval. "I want you to know that I've been talking to someone, a counselor, about family dynamics and maybe some of the ways I've been unfair to you." A counselor? Progress, perhaps, though I wondered what had motivated this sudden interest in self-reflection. "I'm glad you're getting help," I said carefully. "The thing is, Jennifer and I have been having some problems. Financial problems mostly, and relationship problems that probably stem from the financial stress." There it was, the real reason for this call. Not genuine remorse or desire for reconciliation, but another crisis requiring my intervention. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. Despite everything, I didn't want my son to suffer. But my sympathy no longer automatically translated into financial assistance. "The house might go into foreclosure," he continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Jennifer's talking about taking the kids and moving in with her sister in California. I don't know what to do." The old Margaret would have immediately offered solutions. Money to prevent the foreclosure, assistance with legal fees, whatever financial intervention might keep the family together. The new Margaret felt compassion for his situation, while recognizing that his problems were no longer mine to solve. "That sounds very difficult," I said gently. "What do you think you're going to do?" The question clearly caught him off guard. He'd expected either immediate assistance or at least a discussion of possible aid. Instead, I was treating him like a capable adult, responsible for finding his own solutions. I'm not sure. I thought maybe we could talk about it. Maybe over dinner this weekend? "Thomas," I said carefully, "I love you. You're my son, and that will never change. But I can't be your financial safety net anymore. You're 47 years old. You need to find your own way through this." "But Mom, you have the money just sitting there." "I have money that I'm using to live my own life," I interrupted. "I'm taking art classes. I'm planning a trip to Ireland. I'm finally doing things I've wanted to do for decades." The silence that followed was heavy with his disappointment, and, perhaps, the beginning of understanding. "I love you," I repeated before ending the call, "but I won't rescue you from the consequences of your choices anymore." That night, I painted a self-portrait, my first attempt at capturing human features. It was imperfect, certainly, with eyes that weren't quite symmetrical and a mouth that didn't quite match reality. But it was recognizably me, and more importantly, it was painted by someone who finally believed she was worth the time and attention required to create something beautiful. In the painting, I was smiling. 1 year later, I stood in the gardens of Powerscourt in County Wicklow, Ireland, sketching the ancient trees that had witnessed centuries of human joy and sorrow. My watercolor technique had improved dramatically since those first clumsy attempts in my Thursday evening classes, but more importantly, I'd learned to see beauty as something worth capturing rather than something to admire quickly before rushing to the next obligation. The Ireland trip had been everything I'd imagined and more. 3 weeks of wandering through landscapes that seemed painted by God's own hand, staying in small bed and breakfasts where the owners treated me like a cherished guest rather than a convenient ATM. I'd painted the cliffs of Moher at sunset, visited the library at Trinity College where ancient books whispered stories of human persistence, and sat in pubs where strangers became friends over cups of tea and shared stories. For the first time in my adult life, I'd traveled somewhere without checking my phone constantly for family emergencies, without calculating exchange rates to determine if I was spending too much money that might be needed for someone else's crisis, without feeling guilty for the simple pleasure of being exactly where I wanted to be. The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed. At Shannon Airport, waiting for my flight back to Chicago, I'd caught my reflection in a shop window and barely recognized the woman looking back. She carried herself differently, shoulders back, head high, with the confident posture of someone who'd learned her own worth. Her clothes were different too. A flowing scarf I'd bought in Dublin not because it was practical, but because it was beautiful. A small rebellion against a lifetime of purely functional choices. The flight attendant, a young woman with kind eyes, had complimented my watercolor travel journal as I sketched the clouds from my window seat. "These are beautiful," she'd said, genuine admiration in her voice. "You're very talented." "I'm learning," I'd replied, and realized that those 2 words perfectly captured not just my artistic journey, but my entire approach to life. I was learning to value myself, learning to set boundaries, learning to choose joy over obligation. Coming home to Chicago felt different this time. My house on Ashland Avenue hadn't changed physically. Same brick facade, same garden where I'd taught the grandchildren to plant tomatoes. But my relationship to it had transformed completely. It was no longer a shrine to family memories or a place where I waited for others to need me. It had become my sanctuary, my studio, my launching pad for adventures yet to come. The answering machine held 17 messages, but for the first time in years, none of them carried the urgent desperation of financial emergencies. Instead, they were invitations. Maria asking about my trip, the book club wondering if I'd like to present my travel photos at the next meeting, Mrs. Patterson from Riverside Academy requesting my help with a new family history project. The most surprising message came from Lily, now 13 and apparently allowed to make her own phone calls. "Hi, Grandma Margaret," her young voice said, slightly nervous but determined. "I know things have been weird with Mom and Dad, but I wanted you to know that I finished reading all the books in that series you recommended. Could we maybe meet for lunch sometime? Just us? I have things I want to tell you that aren't about money or anything grown up like that." The message had been left 3 days earlier. I called back immediately. "Lily? It's Grandma Margaret. I just got back from Ireland." "Ireland!" Her excitement was genuine, unfiltered by adult agendas. "Did you paint the castles? Did you see sheep everywhere like in the movies?" We talked for 20 minutes about my trip, about her reading, about her middle school drama, and her dreams of maybe becoming a writer someday. Not once did she mention needing anything beyond my attention and interest. We arranged to meet the following Saturday at a small cafe near Lincoln Park Zoo, neutral territory where we could reconnect without the complicated dynamics that had poisoned family gatherings. Lily arrived early, nervous energy radiating from her as she fidgeted with her phone. She'd grown taller in the months since our last real conversation, and something in her eyes suggested she'd been thinking deeply about the adult conflicts swirling around her. "I know Mom and Dad are mad at you," she said without preamble once we'd ordered our sandwiches. "They say you're being selfish and that you don't care about family anymore." I took a careful sip of my tea, choosing my words with the precision of someone who understood that this conversation would shape a relationship for years to come. "What do you think?" I asked her. She considered this seriously, her young face reflecting an emotional intelligence that surprised me. "I think they're scared. I think they got used to you fixing their problems, and now they don't know how to fix them themselves." The insight from a 13-year-old was devastatingly accurate. "I also think," she continued, "that maybe you're not selfish. Maybe you're just tired of being the only grown-up in the family." My eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of profound gratitude for this child who saw me clearly when the adults in her life had reduced me to a collection of financial functions. "I love you, Lily," I said. "I love you and Marcus more than you'll ever know, but I had to learn how to love myself too." She nodded gravely. "Mrs. Patterson says that's what feminism means. Women learning they don't have to disappear to make other people comfortable." We spent the rest of lunch talking about books and Ireland and her growing awareness that the adult world was more complicated than she'd previously understood. When we parted, she hugged me with fierce intensity. "Can we do this again?" she asked. "Like regularly? I miss having someone who listens to my stories." "Every month," I promised. "Just us." The encounter with Lily became a template for rebuilding family relationships on my terms. When Marcus called a few weeks later asking if I'd attend his basketball game, I agreed, but I also made it clear that I was coming as his grandmother who loved him, not as a financial safety net for future sports expenses. Thomas and Jennifer's marriage didn't survive the financial pressures that followed my withdrawal of support. The divorce was messy, complicated by their inability to maintain their lifestyle without my subsidies. Thomas moved into a modest apartment, took a job that paid significantly less than his previous consulting position, and slowly began the process of learning to live within his means. The children spent alternating weeks with each parent, and slowly, carefully, I began rebuilding relationships with them based on love rather than transaction. It wasn't easy. Years of conditioning had taught them to associate my presence with material benefits. But gradually, we found our way back to the simple pleasure of enjoying each other's company. Thomas and I had lunch together 4 months after my return from Ireland. He looked older, worn by the stress of financial reality, but also somehow cleaner, as if the removal of easy money had forced him to examine himself in ways he'd previously avoided. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told me over coffee at the same diner where we'd shared countless meals during his childhood. "About not buying love anymore." I waited, curious about where this conversation would lead. "I think maybe I stopped earning it somewhere along the way," he continued. "Maybe I got so comfortable taking what you offered that I forgot to give anything back." It wasn't a complete apology. There were still undertones of justification, still hints that he believed circumstances had forced his hand. but it was progress. Recognition, at least, that our relationship had become unbalanced. "I don't need you to pay me back," I told him. "Not financially, but I do need you to see me as a person, not just as your mother. I need you to be interested in my life, not just in what my life can provide for yours." We've been working on it ever since. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. He calls now to ask about my art classes, my book club, my travel plans. Sometimes he even shares details about his own struggles and victories, without immediately turning the conversation toward what I might do to help. Jennifer and I may never be close. Too much damage was done during the years when she saw me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a person to respect. But she's learned to be civil, even occasionally kind, and she no longer actively undermines my relationship with the grandchildren. The house feels different now. Where once it echoed with emptiness, it now resonates with chosen solitude. My easel stands in the front window where morning light illuminates my latest painting project. Books stack on every surface. Mysteries, poetry, travel memoirs, art history texts, evidence of a mind finally free to explore its own interests. The refrigerator holds photos from Ireland, pictures of me standing confidently beside ancient stone circles and modern art installations. In each image, I'm smiling with the uncomplicated joy of someone who's learned to be her own best company. Last month, I did something that would have been unthinkable a year ago. I hired a financial advisor to help me plan for my remaining years. Not with the goal of preserving money for inheritance, but with the intention of spending it all on my own life. Travel, art supplies, experiences that bring me joy. These have become my priorities. The advisor, a practical woman in her 50s, smiled when I explained my goals. "Good for you," she said. "Too many people spend their entire lives saving for children who view that savings as an early inheritance rather than appreciation for their parents' sacrifice." As I write this, autumn light streams through my kitchen window, illuminating the watercolor painting I completed yesterday. A self-portrait that finally captures something true about who I've become. The woman in the painting has silver hair and lined skin, but her eyes are bright with possibility. She's wearing the scarf I bought in Dublin, and she's surrounded by paintbrushes, books, and travel brochures for next year's adventure to Scotland. She looks like someone who knows her own worth. Tomorrow, Thomas and the children are coming for dinner. Not because they need something, but because we genuinely enjoy each other's company now that transactional desperation no longer poisons our interactions. I'll cook pot roast with Robert's favorite herbs, and we'll eat around the same table where so many difficult conversations took place. But this time, I'll be sitting there as Margaret Sullivan, artist, traveler, friend, grandmother, not as someone's solution to a problem. This time, I'll be sitting there as myself. Have you ever felt like you disappeared into other people's needs? Have you ever loved someone so much that you forgot to love yourself? I'd love to know your story. Please share it in the comments below. If this message touched something in your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps ensure these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Someone who's still learning, like I did, that being needed isn't the same as being valued, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is teach people to value you properly. Because in the end, we teach people how to love us by showing them how we love ourselves.